In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at another Commander deck profile, which I hope will be a regular routine thing on Tuesdays going forward, but we're going to look at an actual fully finished deck profile for Valgavoth, Harrower of Souls, which was one of the Duskmourn Commander decks. Let's get into it. What's going on, everybody? Thank you so much for being here. I do appreciate each and every one of you guys taking the time to watch these videos. Be sure to hit that like button if you do enjoy what you see, and subscribe if you're not subscribed to the channel. Then click that bell icon if you want to be notified when new videos are posted. So I started this last week with a series I kind of want to become like a weekly thing, and it was for the Myco Tyrant. If you guys saw that video, a good amount of people watched it, and I know I didn't have a list up at the time I posted that, so I've gone ahead and created a list which has been added, and this one will have a list in the description already. If you guys want to take a look at the deck for yourself, we're going to go through it, kind of some of the rationale behind some of the cards in it, and then talk about it a little bit. I don't want it to be too long, but I also wanted to do a little bit of a breakdown on how the deck functions in case people were curious. And then this is a sort of a optimal version of the deck, but I know that for some people budget is definitely a big consideration. So I have put some cards in the sideboard that we'll talk about at the end that are more budget options that can reduce the cost of the deck, or at least give you a starting point to look at. So we'll kind of jump right into it here. And yes, so the commander for the deck is going to be Valgavoth, Harrower of Souls. If you guys are unfamiliar with this card, I have made a couple videos talking about him. We talked about the commander deck itself when the spoilers were announced, and then we talked about some upgrades for the precon. It's a very popular precon, and it's still pretty expensive as of the time that I'm making this video. I'm still not 100% sure why. I do think it's a pretty solid deck overall, but the value just doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and the lack of MSRP does kind of cause that, where if one deck becomes more popular, it could spike, and then it's kind of hard to find it at an affordable price. We've seen it with the past couple of sets. There's typically at least one commander deck that ends up being more pricey than the others. But Valgavoth, if you guys are not familiar with him, he is a 2 black-red legendary creature, Elder Demon with flying. He has ward, pay 2 life, and says whenever an opponent loses life for the first time during each of their turns, put a +1/+1 counter on Valgavoth, Harrower of Souls, and draw a card. Pretty standard, not anything crazy. I did talk about this in my initial reactions, how I do think his ward is kind of inconsequential, specifically because in Commander, 2 life is really not that hard to pay off. I understand that it's designed in a way that, like, if they do try to remove it during their turn, that it's going to trigger his effect, but realistically speaking, a lot of cards that have a stronger ward cost that requires people to pay mana means it's a little bit more tricky to get rid of him. The good thing is he does have a low cost, and we do have some ways in the deck to get him back should he be killed, so there is that. But I do think that in terms of his sturdiness, if you will, he's not exactly the strongest, but he does kind of make up for it. This deck is referred to as a group slug strategy, so you're kind of, instead of, Bumbleflower, which is like a group hug that kind of gives everybody benefits, this slowly but surely kind of drains away at everybody, which is obviously, going to be a deck that it's probably not always going to be the most popular at the table, but I don't think it's at a level of any kind of, toxicity where it's like unfun to play against. It's definitely beatable, and it's a fun strategy. So the general consensus here is you want to damage the opponents during their turn so that you maximize counters and draws, and that's kind of what we're building around here with Rakdos. Now, I have one Planeswalker in the deck, that's Ob Nixilis the Hate Twisted. Actually a pretty budget-friendly card, all things considered. Little costly, but he's one of the ones from War of the Spark. It says, an opponent draws a card, deal 1 damage to that player, and then it does have a -2 to destroy target creature, let this controller draw 2 cards. Honestly, both of these effects work well with the commander, so there is that. You get this guy out, they draw, they're taking damage, but then being able to remove something is certainly nice. Typically, this is probably going to be something people try to swing at right away, so that it's not able to start destroying stuff, but it's still a good enough card to include, and does sort of allow, like I said, a bit of budget flexibility. I'm not going to go through the individual, I'm not going to read out the effects of every card, but I will kind of go through them and just like briefly spotlight any that I think are kind of important. Barb Flare Gremlin is one of the new cards from the commander deck, and it does do damage whenever a player taps a land, so this is a good way to trigger Valgavoth. However, note that it does allow an extra mana to be added, so there is that, the opponent taps, they're getting an extra mana, they are taking a damage, so hopefully you can kind of keep pace with them, but it's a card that is, it's not amazing, but it still works well with what you want to do with the commander. Blood Artist, just generically a really strong card in a lot of different decks that do play black, and this works well with what we're looking to do here, especially if you have ways to get stuff off the board. Bloodseeker, also a card I actually wasn't very familiar with prior to doing the research for this video, but it is whenever an opponent creature enters, you may have that player lose a life. So you're basically having this out and they play something, you're going to be able to trigger Valgavoth right off of that. Fate Unraveler, another card, when they draw a card, you deal damage to that player. And there's a lot of cards like this that we're trying to like deal damage with little, paper cuts, if you will, both to get down the life of the opponent, but also have consistent ways to like make sure we're dealing damage during their turn. Gleeful Arsonist, also another new card from the Duskmourn Commander decks. This one's a little bit better. Whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, it deals damage equal to that creature's, equal to its own power, rather, to that player. And then it has Undying. So at the very least, if they play a non-creature spell, it's pinging for a damage. Pretty low cost too, so it's got that going for it. And then just generally speaking is an overall solid card. Harsh Mentor, another cheap card that does, whenever opponent activates the ability of an artifact, creature, or land, if it's not a mana ability, deal damage. Not the most, obviously there are a lot of abilities that are mana abilities, but it's still a good enough option, and like I said, pretty budget friendly in that regard. So I was trying to be mindful when putting this together, like a mixture of like affordability, but also like if you want to play the deck at its strongest, you do want to include some of the more power cards. And I'll talk about the few that are expensive that I think are definitely the most important inclusions. We've got Carter, Doomscourge, just a really good card that does, deal some extra damage, and also kind of it has a goad-ish effect where it basically makes it so all your opponent's creatures have to attack, but they don't attack you, if possible. So it's just a pretty good option there. Cataract Parasite, another really, really good card. When an opponent draws a card, if you control a red permanent, it deals 1 damage to that player. This only costs 1 to play, and if you have your commander out, you meet that requirement. So just, it's a very good card. Mayhem Devil, same thing, whenever a player sacks a permanent. These are all cards that are just basically, how can we hit the opponent for 1 life? Nightshade Harvester, another strong card that kind of does the same thing. Whenever an opponent plays a land, they lose a life, and then this card gets a counter. Now, Obnixilis is a card you might be familiar with. It's part of many like OTKs where you can do like infinite mana burn combos. A little pricier at $15. However, this card is extremely strong. It's also searchable, and it does a lot, especially because you have a lot of cards that can deal exactly 1 damage. So you can kind of make this thing beefy as well as get impulse draw, and it does last until the end of the next turn. I would definitely recommend this as one of the cards if you are working on a budget and can get this or have this already. It's a really good inclusion in the deck. Orcish Bowmasters is an extremely good card. I think everybody's pretty familiar with this card, but it is also quite pricey. This is probably one you could cut if you wanted to, but if you have access to it or you own it already, it's basically an auto include, because not only is it just really strong in general, it's extremely strong with the commander. Persistent Constrictor, another good card here. Opponent loses a life, and you put a -1/-1 counter on their creatures. New from Duskmourn, decent card, and, like I said, pretty inexpensive. Rampaging Ferocidon, same thing. Whenever another creature enters, their controller takes 1 damage, and players can't gain life. So it's sort of a double-edged sword, but in a good way, for you, and bad for the opponent. Razorkin Needlehead is another card from Duskmourn. This is not from the commander deck, but this card is just extremely strong. Deals a damage whenever they draw a card. I mean, you get a lot of these things out. You start pinging the opponents for damage. Obviously, 1 life is not a lot, but if you have 3 or 4 creatures that are dealing 1 damage every time they draw, you're going to become a problem pretty quickly. So you're going to be able to put a lot of pressure on the opponents, and ideally with the cards you're drawing, you're able to move things along a lot faster. Rug of Smothering, just a decent, low-to-the-ground artifact creature that, whenever an opponent casts a spell, they lose a life for each spell they've cast. Just another way to ping for 1. Sheoldred, we know Sheoldred. I don't know why this is not in an English version. That's my fault. I probably should have double checked that. But again, really expensive card. So if you have one or you have access to it, it's a great inclusion. But if you don't, certainly you can put some stuff in there and shave a lot off the value of the deck. Solemn Simulacrum, just a good card in general. Lord of Pain, actually the other face commander in the precon, and definitely has his own strategy that can make him work. But he's still pretty good, I think, and probably worth including, especially if you're buying the precon. You're already going to have him, you might as well play him. And then Zozu the Punisher, this card has seen a significant spike, unfortunately, due to the popularity of this deck, but if you already had one from when they were cheap, whenever a land comes into play, that land controller takes 2 damage. This is really good. I mean, your opponents are losing 2 land every time they play a land, and that, they're playing fetches or something, they're taking 4. That's 10% of the life right off the bat and still triggering your effect. So this is the monster lineup here for the creatures. And like I said, we will talk about a few budget options as we get to the other part of the video, but let's move on to sorceries. Blasphemous Act, just a really good board wipe, not expensive, so not bad. Damnation, a little pricier, but a really good card in general. Obviously, you know, just one of the most iconic cards. Demonic Council, really good, pretty inexpensive. Search for a demon. We do play some demons in here, which is great. But if you have 4 or more card types, you can search for anything instead. So it's a good budget-friendly tutor that can get stuff in the deck like your Ob Nixilis, while also later in the game or even early, depending on how quickly you're able to get stuff going, can be really powerful. Demonic Tutor, same thing, just a really good card, but it is pricey. There are cheaper alternatives that are not as good, but still, you know, get you what you need, just at a bit of a slower pace. Diabolic Tutor is cheaper, pretty good, just costs more mana. Gamble, I think, is a solid card. Obviously, the discard risk is always there, but we're playing stuff that can reanimate, bring things back, and being able to search for something, get it out of the deck is always pretty good. That reanimate here is, I think, very important, especially if your commander dies. You can bring them back without having to invest the extra mana. And then we've got Sign in Blood, just good draw power. And you can, you know, in theory, use this to ping your opponent for life in combination with some of your other cards that burn them when they draw. But keep in mind that typically won't work with your commander specifically, so there is just that to consider. And then Toxic Deluge, pretty affordable as well. Been reprinted quite a few times, just a really good board wipe. And then obviously, depending on, you know, how you utilize this, you can probably get some triggers off of things like Blood Artist with it too. For the instance, nothing super crazy here with the exception of, you know, Vampiric Tutor and I guess, you know, to an extent, Deflecting Swat's still pretty pricey, but Bedevil, just good removal. Blood Pact, similar thing, but you can use this on the opponent's turn, so make them draw, lose life, and then trigger your commander. Cabal Ritual is just good ramp, pay 2 to get 3, or 5 if you have 7 or more cards engraved, so it's solid. Definitely not an auto-include, but I think it's good. Dark Ritual, same thing. This card's like the bazillion printings, and it can help you get your commander out realistically by turn 2, which is good. Deadly Relic, I think, is really good. I would honestly say this is another card that's probably worth including if you can get it. I know it's a little on the pricier side, but with how you know, often you're going to be able to kind of... You want to get your commander out as soon as possible, obviously, and being able to remove some problematic stuff without having to pay mana so you can save your mana to utilize other things to get his effects rolling. Not to mention the amount of times you're drawing cards, ideally, in a turn cycle, means these free cast spells are really good. Same with Deflecting Swat. Like I said, this one is expensive, but your opponents are obviously going to want to remove Valgavoth if he's starting to become a problem, and this can kind of help protect that. So it's one of those cards that, like, I do think is worth including if you have it or can get one. I mean, maybe you proxy with friends. I don't know. You know, whatever works. But in terms of the card's application, I do think Deflecting Swat is really good. Entomb, another good card here that's just good to get stuff engraved. It does sort of accelerate some of our cards that want to have a certain number of things engraved, but also generally, if you can put something engraved and then bring it back, you have some kind of quicker ways to accelerate to some of your other combo pieces, like Ob Nixilis, like other things. So I think it's decent. It thins the deck. And then we've got Fell the Profane, Infernal Grasp, just good removal. Rakdos Charm, pretty inexpensive card that can do different things, and it is an instant, so you can kind of deal damage to the opponents with it. And then Vampiric Tutor. Again, I have Vampiric Tutor, so I always include this on my deck list just because I already own it. I'm already playing it. If you don't, again, I know it's pricey. There are some other cards that can kind of be included. So there, like I said, we'll talk about a few budget options in a minute here. And the artifacts: Arcane Signet, Fellwar Stone, just good ramp. I got all 3 boots in here: Lava Spur, Lightning Greaves, and Swiftfoot. I think, you know, being able to protect your commander is really important, and all 3 of these cards can help to do that and stack onto his ward cost as well, because he's kind of the thing that makes it all run. Mana Vault, just an extremely good card, and realistically the best ramp we have at this juncture with the stuff that was recently banned. But again, it's like over $100, so if you want to play something in its place, there are obviously some mana rocks, even things that like come in tapped or whatever, that'll give you some mana ramp without breaking the bank if it's a card you don't have. And then just Rakdos, Soul Ring, Talisman, Thought Vessel. The One Ring, another card that is, you know, admittedly pretty expensive, but like for colors like red that just don't have that much draw power outside of like Wheel of Fortune, like I do think the draw power is super important. If you were someone who was able to get this card, you know, when it came out in the bundle or what have you, or have just had one for a while, it's really good, kind of an auto include in this deck, because it's just one of those cards that is so abhorrently broken in terms of its design that like it gives you some significant advantages when playing it. And then for the enchantments, I think Animate Dead is solid. I just think in general, when you're playing mono black, it's stuff that has ways to get things engraved in conjunction with another color. Being able to bring those things back is good. Bastion of Remembrance, a great way to ping. Black Market Connections, just a solid resource. You know, what do you need and when do you need it? You can make, you know, different ways to work that out. Mana Barbs is good for dealing damage. You obviously take damage from it as well, but it's kind of worth it to take the damage when your opponents are taking, ideally more, and you're maybe playing a bit more carefully. Phyrexian Arena, just good draw power, cheap card. Pyrohemia is kind of on the pricey side, but it's not a bad card. You pay 1 to deal a damage to each creature and each player. You do have to sack it at the end of the turn if there's no creatures in play, but I think that's kind of a worthwhile alternative to have. Roiling Vortex, pretty good, same thing, deals the damage at the beginning of the upkeep, and then can also deal additional damage and stop your opponents from gaining life, so all around, I mean, this was like a 25-cent card that did go up with this deck's release, but it's still, I think, in the realm of affordability. Spiteful Visions, not bad. They draw an additional card, but whenever a player draws a card, they take damage. You're also playing multiple other cards that do the same thing to your opponent, so yeah, draw an extra card, go ahead, and then we're going to go ahead and burn you for extra damage. Sulfuric Vortex, same thing, just dealing damage during the upkeep, and stops players in general from gaining life. And then Underworld Dreams, whenever an opponent draws, deal the damage. Like, you can kind of see, obviously, a lot of cards that have similar effects, but if you get multiple of them out and the opponents can't remove them, they're taking a lot of damage every draw, and it can go from, like, a slow burn to, like, a quick kill pretty easily. For the lands, I mean, this is a very, like, optimal land base. There are obviously a lot of cards in here that are a bit pricey. The Ancient Tomb is definitely by no means a mandatory inclusion, but it's good if you have it. I am a big proponent of, I think the fetch lands are extremely good. I think they're worth playing in every single deck you can play them in. For one, because I think even a lower power deck can be really strong if it does have the ability to fix your mana more quickly. And most of the fetches are kind of more budget friendly now. If you're talking, $10 to $12, obviously everyone's budget is subjective. I'm certainly not implying that they're quote unquote cheap, but for cards that have historically been, $40 plus, I don't know, $10 seems like not too bad to me. But again, for the fetches and stuff, you can swap them out with like Terramorphic Expanse, Evolving Wilds, things of that nature. Or just play more basics. I mean, we are playing basics in here with the mountains. Just kind of any decent Rakdos land, anything that's typed that I can fetch is in here. Command Tower, Fabled Passage is fetching stuff. Luxury Suite is pretty good, but you can cut any of the fetches that might be out of your budget and replace them with either some basics or some tap lands, some of the temples. This is an optimal version, I think, and that's sort of what the intent is here, except Shivan Gorge pretty good here because this deals damage to the opponents. So this is a good card, but it was reprinted in the deck as well. Just, any of the lands that are expensive, you can substitute tap lands or lesser lands for it. But if you have them, obviously, I think this is a pretty good land base to have. And then just kind of in terms of some budget options here, these are just some cards that work well within the deck. Bloodfell Caves is just one example of, many different tap lands that come in that are not typed that can still do these types of things. So obviously, if you're playing on a budget, those are definitely things you can reduce the price of the deck by quite a lot. Chaos Warp is a solid card. Honestly, I almost included in the main deck, not as a side budget option, but I don't know, hit or miss on that card because the random aspect of it can be a bit problematic. Feed the Swarm is pretty good, maybe instead of Deadly Rollick if you don't have the card or don't want to spend the money. Gary, Grey Merchant of Asphodel, good card here, kind of an annoying card to play against, but you do play a lot of stuff that can burn, and obviously if you can gain some life, that's pretty good too. Same with Great Unclean One, dealing some extra damage, but it doesn't typically deal damage during the opponent's turn, so that's sort of the downside on him, if you will. Lightning Bolt, just a solid card overall, could realistically be in the main deck. Swap it out for Deflecting Swat if you again, if it doesn't work within your budget. Massacre Worm, pretty good. Like, whenever an opponent's creature dies, they lose 2 life, so you can ping stuff during their turns, deal extra damage. Morbid Opportunist, pretty good. Revenge of Ravens, another one, like, just pinging for damage. Spell Shock is decent enough. It's not really budget at 6, but you can probably get it for around $3, $2.50 for like a light play version. Spike Corridor, another decent card here. And then we've got Sir Conrad the Grim, pretty good. Whenever a card is put into a graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield, deals a damage to your opponent. So if they're discarding or milling or whatever, he's a nice option to have. So yeah, that's the deck profile. I know I talked a little fast there. I tried to be clear and concise, but also this is going on nearly 20 minutes, and I know the way these videos typically work is people are going to skip through and mostly just look at the list. So if you are interested in the breakdowns, at least that's, hopefully be sectioned out for you so you can kind of take a look. But if you guys like this type of video and this type of format, definitely let me know. I'll continue to make them weekly, talking about some different decks, and I'll continue to include some budget options and maybe do some more budget overall. But I do think it's also good to kind of present a deck in its, like, in an ideal, like, we're not talking about cards like True Duels and stuff, but we're talking about, like, what are the most optimal cards, and then you can kind of pick and choose yourself what you want to take out and what you think is important and what is worth your budget. So that's going to do it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Catch you in the next one. Peace.